We've got Dr. Makeen Makeen, who's come rather shorter distance from up the road from SOAS. He is a lecturer in commercial law there, and he's going to speak about the developing nations.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to join this distinguished panel and to bore those distinguished guests to death. We have 20 minutes to share, Adrian and myself, so I'll try to keep it only to 10, 15. One of the most difficult things we face in the copyright world as far as non-European, non-North American countries is the term developing countries. It's a term that it's undefined, and it's really difficult to try to define it for copyright purposes or the culture industry in general. However, for the purposes of this talk, I will use the term developing country to mean a country that pays a subscription fee that is specified for a developing country under the rules of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And by doing that, I'm really circumventing the issue. In the last 15 years, the developing countries have been incredibly active in enacting new pieces of legislation, either because they never had copyright law before and they were introducing copyright law for the first time, or to expand the scope of the already existing law. Why did they do that? They did that because in 1994, we had what's sometimes referred to as a swear word in the developing countries, which is the TRIPS. And if you want to join the WTO, you have to comply with the requirements of the TRIPS. Otherwise, you will become one of them. So all the developing countries wanted to be one of the us, and they passed new laws to comply with TRIPS. Although TRIPS did not ask any developing country to offer moral rights protection, most of the developing countries who enacted new laws or expanded their already existing laws in the last 15 years, offered a very comprehensive type of moral rights protection. The reasons were three for that. The first reason is that the developing countries wanted to sell the TRIPS agreement to its own public. So whilst their own public were saying, oh, we are selling out all our national interest, you are passing a new piece of legislation to comply with TRIPS, and by the way, we're going to get nothing out of protecting foreign copyright works. So the developing countries, or some of them, started using the moral rights issue for their own national authors as a way of convincing their own public that moral right, that copyright is not a harmful thing. And this argument was presented by authors in the developing countries. So in most countries, the government asked authors to make their claims, and they gave them the frequency spectrum, and they gave them the space in the media to make these arguments as if the arguments is genuinely coming from authors. The second reason is that the developing countries accepted that there is more to gain than to lose from either recognizing moral rights protection for the first time or extending the scope of the already existing moral rights. And the third reason is linked to the second, is that some of the developing countries hoped, and they still do hope, that they can protect their cultural heritage by moral rights or semi or quasi system to moral rights. Some of them now, they started calling it with the term which is the sui generis. Some of them still call it under copyright, and I will discuss that at the end of my talk again. So this is the general view why the developing countries started becoming interested in moral rights in the last 15 years or so. The next 3 or 4 minutes, I will divide the developing countries into 2 groups. Although it's incredibly difficult to talk about the developing countries, all of them, and to put them in one pigeonhole, it's still also difficult to put them in 2 pigeonholes. But just because I like to generalize, So I'll put them in two pigeonholes, and I would say that in the developing countries, we have two major copyright systems, one which is the author's right or the droit d'auteur, and the other one which is the copyright. Strangely enough, this distinction between the civil law systems and the common law system, or the author's right versus the copyright, was not based on colonial links at all. So for example, Egypt, which was occupied by Britain for over 70 years, after independence, Egypt chose the civil law system, i.e. the author's right. And by Egypt adopting the civil law system or the author's right approach, Egypt influenced another 19 countries around it, which for some bizarre reason, whilst they were copying the Egyptian laws, they even copied the mistakes in the Egyptian laws. And we have another group of countries, which are the common law countries. So let me talk about the civil law countries or the author's right systems first. In the developing countries, you'll find the civil law, the countries that followed the civil law system tradition or the author's right tradition, they did not really follow the German approach. They followed the French approach. And you will find them introducing four major types, which is the right to divulge the work, the right to paternity, the right of integrity, and the right to withdraw from circulation. Some countries like Armenia introduced even a fifth right, which is arguably a moral right, which is the right of access. So if you're a painter, you've made a picture, it took you 20 years to draw, to come up with the painting, and then you sell it, but you want to have access to this painting one more time just to inspire or to inspire you to paint something else. The law gives you this license, which is Article 1124 of the Armenian law. Armenia doesn't have 1,000 articles in its copyright system, so don't get very excited about it. I think what happened is that Armenia 2 years ago, instead of having the copyright law as a standing alone piece of legislation, it decided to incorporate it into the civil code, and that's why it became Article 1124. And these rights are, more often than not in the civil law countries, in the developing countries, are inalienable, they are perpetual, and they are imprescriptible. And when we're talking about inalienable, most of the civil law countries, with the exception of Lebanon, really, most of the developing countries that followed the civil law system or the author's right system do not allow authors neither to assign nor to waive their moral rights. So unlike in the United Kingdom when you can waive but you cannot assign, in the developing countries you cannot do either.